I'm pretty sure it's legal to drink anytime in Wisconsin. So, and I'm glad the live audience got that there. But welcome to Practically Tactical. This is our live show streamed to you on YouTube. Finally, it has actually been over 30 days since we've recorded a live show. So I'm pretty much a virgin again here, and I figured the best person to fix that for me would be Ryan from Handgun Radio. So so thanks for coming on, man.
Is that the mildly inappropriate intro you had?
No, that I just made up. So we haven't even got to that part yet. But thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
Hey, no problem.
For you guys out there, check in the description box below. There are links to Handgun Radio's website where you can listen to his show. Also, please subscribe to his YouTube channel. That link is down below, too. He definitely needs more subscribers. Has a bunch of cool stuff there. And we also have links to his Facebook page. Go like Handgun Radio on Facebook as well. Again, that is down in the description box below. So please go do that. And let's see here. Be sure to put your questions in the chat or the Google Q&A app. We will get to those during some dedicated Q&A segments. If you put in questions, we will answer them live. So be sure to click that like and share button on the video. Help spread the word around YouTube. So again, please check out Ryan. Again, in the description box below, please check him out. That's really important. He has a fantastic show, even though he doesn't talk about Glocks enough. So, but let's move on to the show. Welcome to Practically Tactical, episode 42, brought to you by the Firearms Radio Network. The Practically Tactical show features a roundtable discussion about guns, gear, and shooting. For more information on the show, links to our guests, guns, and gear we discuss, please visit practacpodcast.com/042. I'll tell you what, I got an awesome gentleman on the show. The accolades are near endless of this gentleman. He may look familiar to you. He is host of Handgun Radio here on the Firearms Radio Network. We have Ryan Michaud. He's also known for being one of the firearms evaluators on the Road Show on PBS, the Antique Road Show. And I believe he was also, no, I'm not going to say it. He is just the host of Handgun Radio here on Firearms Radio Network. We have Ryan Michaud. Thanks for coming on, man.
Hey, no problem. I wish I had that job. That would be awesome.
I was going to say one more inappropriate thing, but obviously we're joking there. But you guys, hopefully you guys all listen to Handgun Radio. If not, this is Ryan. He hosts Handgun Radio. Awesome guy, awesome dude, awesome show. So please check it out. So we're doing a themed show, we'll say, of kind of like a Revolvers 101. And I think I just learned about that there's actually Revolvers probably a couple weeks ago. I walked into work and I saw one of these things in the gun case. And I was like, what is that? And I took a picture of it and I sent it to Ryan. He was like, that's a revolver. I'm like, they make those? Really? I thought they were movie props. So I brought Ryan on to tell us all about them. So thanks for coming on, man.
Hey, no worries.
So they are real. I didn't know.
They do exist.
And they're guns.
And they work, unlike some people will have you believe.
So we're going to do a Revolvers 101 show for you guys today. I could definitely learn a lot more about revolvers. They are fantastic guns. The first time I ever shot a revolver is actually up on my YouTube channel. I think I shot a 686 first.
Yeah, L-frame Smith.
Yep. And I'll tell you what, shooting single action is so fun. It just is ridiculous fun.
It is fun. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but there are times you don't want to shoot single action, but single action is fun. You get that nice crisp trigger pull that you're never going to get on most of your automatics you're going to shoot.
Yes, and for those out there, when we say automatics, what we mean by that is it automatically loads the next bullet. A lot of people get confused.
Right, semi-auto.
Yeah, because you'll hear like 45 ACP. The A stands for automatic and ACP. That just means it automatically loads the next round. So, but maybe kind of back in the day there, maybe to kind of cover a little bit here to segment into history of revolvers is when we termed the phrase automatics, that was just back in the day going from revolvers to automatics, quote unquote, was the automatics just came from it automatically loaded in another round, not automatic, fire rate.
Right. Another one of the popular terms back then was self-loading pistol.
Self-loading.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're learning stuff already here. Look at this. But let's move on to our main segment here with revolvers. So, Ryan, can you kind of share a little bit of history of kind of revolvers with everybody?
Sure. Revolvers have really been around since the early to mid 1800s, 1830s, and so early on there were revolver type weapons that were commonly known as the pepper boxes. If you ever played Clue, the little tiny piece there, the little tiny pistol. The revolver is a pepper box, usually the little game piece. Pepper box handguns used several barrels that rotated around an axis, so you'd have like 6 individual barrels that would rotate when you actuated the firearm, and then you would just load the barrels and you'd have several repeatable shots, which was quite an advantage during the age of a single-shot muzzle-loading handgun. In 1836, Samuel Colt came up with the idea to have a revolving cylinder with chambers, and then have one single unmoving barrel. So you would have a cylinder window or something like that, and then have that barrel and have the chambers there that would hold the rounds, and that would increase accuracy because you only have one point you need to aim with, and then it would also reduce the bulk of the handgun because you wouldn't have 6 individual barrels sticking all the way out of the end of the gun. So Colt started out with the Patterson revolver, and he named it that because the original Colt factory, quote-unquote factory, was started in Patterson, New Jersey. The Patterson was a 5-shot percussion revolver that utilized some of the then new technology that the Industrial Revolution was bringing to the forefront in firearms manufacturing. The Patterson found great favor among lawmen, including the Texas Rangers. There was one notable incident with Texas Ranger Jack Hayes, who was surrounded by a bunch of attackers, and he had a single-shot muzzle-loading rifle, and he fired that first shot. Well, all these attackers, being used to him having a single-shot firearm, rushed him because he had fired his single shot. Well, he pulled out his 5-shot revolver and ended up killing all of them. So they were a little bit surprised. It allowed the Rangers to have that firearm that could just be fired repeatedly 5 times before having to stop and reload. So that was a huge advantage, like we discussed before. And then sort of moving on, this is sort of a quick primer. This is not really a detailed explanation, but 2 individuals by the name of Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson imagined a concept of, rather than having the percussion caps on the back of the cylinder and loading from the front of the chamber, you would actually have a revolver that utilized a self-contained metallic cartridge, and it loaded from the rear. A former Colt employee engineer by the name of Roland White held this patent to a bored-through cylinder. So he basically patented a cylinder that was bored from the back end to the front end completely through. And actually, Colt had rejected this idea when White had brought it to him. So the 2 men approached him, and they figured out a royalty deal, and he allowed them to use that idea. And with that, the company Smith & Wesson was born, starting with the S&W No. 1 revolver in .22 Short. 22 Short was actually the first metallic cartridge, discounting some of the Flaubert and Pinfire French rounds, but was the first commercially viable self-contained cartridge. From there, revolver development accelerated rapidly, larger calibers becoming more available and better designs becoming available as well. Oftentimes, actually, the European designers sometimes led the pack. In 1873, the French issued their military the French 1873 revolver, so named, and it was actually a double-action revolver firing, I think it was an 11mm metallic cartridge, a lot less powerful than R45 Colt that we issued at the same time, but they were issuing a double-action revolver to their armed forces, whereas we were still using a single-action, the Colt Model P or the Peacemaker. So that was a huge advantage because rather than having to manually cock the firearm every time, one could just pull it out and pull the trigger to fire. And things just basically progressed from there, and after a while, we ended up where we are today.
So the only thing that was sucky about the French 1873 was the French soldier.
I'm not going to go there. You can go there.
Well, and thank you for sharing that there. I mean, and it's amazing too how, I mean, nowadays I think we're really blessed with gun design, and I mean, look where everything started and where we are now. But back then, I mean, this just had to be this was a game changer, in reality, wasn't it?
It really was, and the 22 Short, we look at it today and we're like, that's a nothing cartridge. But back in the day, where you had to load loose powder ball and then have a cap, having something that you could just basically, the Smith & Wesson No. 1 was a tip-up, so you undid a latch on the bottom down by the trigger, and it actually tipped up, and you'd pull the cylinder off and load the rounds in, and that was, like, revolutionary, in the era where you had to pour powder and stuff in individually. I mean, people would carry extra cylinders with their percussion guns just to be able to reload faster. because it was just so much faster than reloading the gun on the fly. And you're not going to reload something on the back of a horse that's percussion.
Yeah. You could try, but
the one thing we did have was, I think, better ammunition development. If I had an opinion on that, that French, they did use that double action revolver, but the round was not really powerful at all compared to what we were issuing, which we know today is 45 Colt or 45 long Colt.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, we had better ammunition development, but it wasn't always us that were leading the pack in terms of revolver development.
Okay, so the Smith & Wesson #1 revolver. What year was that released? When did that come out?
I want to say that was in like 1850s, I believe,
okay.
Mid 1850s, if I recall correctly.
Okay, so that was about the last time you could find 22
yeah.
on the shelves. So let's move on to current times. Have a lot of things changed since kind of we dropped off on the history there with revolvers, or where are we currently at in regards to innovation and the revolver market?
Well, in the late 1800s, Smith came out with pretty much what everybody would recognize as a modern revolver, the hand ejector. And it, instead of using some of the loading techniques like we'll talk about later, instead of using like a side loading gate, it used a swing out cylinder. So you could press a thumb latch, swing the cylinder out to the side, and just dump all the empties with this ejection rod that you would hit with your hand, and that's why they called it the hand ejector. And that grew into the Smith & Wesson Model 10, or the Military and Police, the original Military and Police, which was one of the most popular law enforcement revolvers well into the 80s and sometimes even into the 90s. And then, with advances in cartridge design and modern manufacturing techniques, we're really in the golden era of double-action revolvers. The advances in machinery, materials, and manufacturing have just done wonders for it. For instance, you take a look at the new Smith & Wesson Model 929 Jerry Miculek signature model. It utilizes everything that's modern in firearms design, pretty much. Utilizes a stainless steel frame, a Performance Center custom-tuned action, and then it also uses a titanium cylinder, which reduces the rotating mass and improves the trigger pull. And using that precision machinery to have the tolerances and the repeatability that was really unheard of years earlier, has really helped make the guns more consistent and more, they work a lot better. Because back in the day, this sort of stuff, a lot of times, it was necessary to have it hand-fitted. Stuff like the Python, for instance, the techniques that were used to make that, there was a lot of hand-fitting with that gun. Today, I don't even know if you could do the Python on CNC machinery and get the same feel that you did. So a lot of that stuff had to be done by hand, which resulted in higher labor costs and ultimately a higher cost to the consumer. But really, with the advances we've had, you have a lot more consistency and a lot more repeatability, which is good, especially when you've got so many guns rolling off the line.
Well, I think no matter what time frame you look at, I mean, there's always this debate of well, revolvers are more reliable than semi-autos, which we can debate that, but I think really no matter what time frame you look at, other than there are some bad revolvers, which hopefully we'll talk about. Revolvers are just reliable, though. I mean, it doesn't really matter if it was back then with handcrafted stuff or nowadays. They're pretty much always been reliable, haven't they?
My opinion on this is pretty simple, and I have had my revolver break on me once. In my experience, revolvers have more mean time between failures, meaning that you're going to be able to put more rounds through your revolver before you have a failure. The problem is, when you do have a failure, it tends to be so catastrophic that the gun cannot be used.
Okay.
I have my Model 60, for instance. I was shooting it, and there's a piece of metal that connects the thumb latch to the cylinder pin, which allows you to open the cylinder up. And I had that break on me. It's called the bolt. And I had that break on me, and I was able to finish the cylinder, but I could not open the gun to reload it because it was broken. Now, if you need to reload and you're in a defensive situation, that's not really good. And it was not something I could fix in the field. I had to take the gun home and take it apart to actually fix it.
Okay. Well, we'll hit maybe some more on this here in a minute. But for Revolver. So like, what types of revolvers are there? Is there basically kind of two types of revolvers?
There are really two main categories, and this, whether or not they are cartridge firing or black powder, the revolvers are divided into two main categories: single action and double action. So like you touched upon earlier, the single action, the revolver requires the hammer to be pulled back after each shot in order to advance the cylinder and prepare the next round for firing. Pulling the trigger without the hammer being pulled back will basically do nothing. Old examples of this are like the single action army, like we talked about, and then some of the new examples are like the Freedom Arms guns, which are designed for the heavier calibers, and then the North American Arms mini revolvers, all of which are single action. So that forces you actually have to, you pull the gun out, cock the hammer, pull the trigger, cock the hammer, pull the trigger. You can't just pull the trigger like you would on a double action revolver.
Okay. And then obviously we have double action is left.
Right. In the double action, you can either cock it manually or just pull the trigger through the entire stroke, which will do everything. It'll bring the hammer back and then let it drop, firing the revolver. Most of your defensive revolvers that we're talking about today are going to be double action revolvers, and a lot of these you'll actually see with the single action notch on the hammer removed and have the hammer spur ground down for defensive use. That's something we'll probably talk about a little bit later. It mainly negates any argument that the user cocked the revolver in a stressful situation and potentially had a negligent discharge and didn't intend to shoot the person. That's been brought up several times in many different court cases.
Really?
Yeah, people, if there is the perception that you could have cocked the revolver, I guarantee you the prosecutor will try to go there, either in a criminal suit or a civil suit.
So basically showing intent that the planning was there or something, I guess?
Well, if you think about a defensive encounter, you're using what's called an affirmative defense. So you're saying, yes, I shot that person, yes, I injured or killed them, but here was the reason that I did that. I had a reason they were attacking me, so on and so forth. There is no affirmative defense for I was holding this person at gunpoint and the gun accidentally went off. You are now treading into territory where you can't really defend. I mean, it was an accident, okay, but you can't say, well, I was holding them at gunpoint, but it went off, and so, yeah, it doesn't work that way.
Okay. Okay, gotcha. So basically we talked about the actions there. So how do they work? So it doesn't matter if you have single or double action. However you do that action, after that it's pretty identical no matter what action, right?
Pretty much. I mean, you'll have your different action weights. Obviously, different manufacturers have different feels. I tend to prefer the Smith & Wessons. I have shot the Colts. I don't really care for on the Colts and through the trigger stroke, the double action trigger stroke. They sort of stack up, so it gets heavier as you progressively pull the trigger back before it breaks. Whereas with the Smith & Wesson, there seems to be sort of like a little hump in the middle. You'll bring it back and you'll have a pretty firm resistance. And then it'll sort of let up a little bit where you can kind of stage the hammer and then continue the pull through and finally let the hammer drop. So it depends, I mean, upon the manufacturer, the price point, the quality, so on and so forth. They pretty much all use either a coil or a flat mainspring inside the grip frame that will provide the power for the hammer and the trigger. Most of them will use a trigger return spring, and if you open up the side of a revolver, like a Smith & Wesson or something, if you don't know what you're looking at, you'll open it up, and you could be the most experienced person with automatics or semi-autos, and you would look at that and just be like, whoa, okay, I don't know what the hell's going on here. There is a lot to them, but once you figure out what all the parts do and know where their place is and what function they have to perform, it gets a lot easier to understand why they're there. Some manufacturers, like Smith & Wesson, for instance, I spoke with Grant Cunningham about this. He said that a lot of the Smith & Wesson parts inside the revolver, they all have a single function. They all pretty much perform a single function. They don't do 2 or 3 different things. Colts, on the other hand, which he's famous for gunsmithing, he noted that they'll have one part that will do 3 or 4 different things. And that's what makes them so hard to gunsmith, because if you alter one part to do something you want it to do, you may inadvertently cause it to do something else improperly. So some guns are more complicated than others. But all in all, I mean, for their quote-unquote complication, you tend to not have as many failures with a revolver.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how many parts are in a revolver, if you had to guess?
Oh, let's see. In a Smith & Wesson, you've got the trigger, obviously, the trigger return bar and spring, the main spring, the hammer, the cylinder unit, which comes out with the ejector rod. I mean, I'd say if you opened up the side plate, you'd be looking at probably 10 to 12 parts, maybe.
Okay, so they're somewhat simple but kind of complex, if that sounds kind of right.
Yes, exactly. That's pretty much it. If you look at them, like the ones that have the clear side plates are really cool because you can kind of get an image of what they do, and I hate to use the term Rube Goldberg because it kind of implies that it's not something that's going to work right, but it's something you would look at and you'd be like, how did they figure out how to get this to make this do that and then make this do that, and everything kind of works in concert. So when you see the trigger pulled through the stroke and you can actually see what's going on underneath that side plate, it's really amazing to see the interplay between all those different parts.
We'll just call it like 7 degrees to Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, basically.
Of pulling the trigger to the bullet leaving. That's maybe a weird way to say it. But here was something we were talking about off air, kind of before the show, and we threw it in. Maintenance on a revolver. So all of us are familiar with semi-autos, field strip, clean. Generally, that'll take care of the job. If you might ever have to, take apart a trigger assembly, just to clean stuff, or clean out your firing pin channel, whatever. Nothing is too difficult really on the semi-auto sides. What about for revolvers? What's kind of the breakdown methodology, we'll say, of it? And then can you just recommend maybe some products or how people should maintenance their revolvers? And we'll put this in the beginning. Don't use WD-40. Do not use WD-40 on any firearm, no matter what. We don't care, right?
Here's a story I shared with Handgun Newbie here. A fellow approached me with a Smith & Wesson, I believe it was a Model 10 that he had, and he said it wasn't popping primers. He was taking it to the range and it wasn't shooting, and he didn't know what was going on. So I told him to bring it in to me. So I took it home, I loaded up some snap caps, and I pulled the trigger, and I went all the way through the back end of the stroke, and then the hammer fell, and I slowly watched the hammer fall and just lightly go back to where it was. And I could have literally stuck my finger in front of the hammer and stopped it during its travel. It was probably a good 3 or 4 seconds of travel, which is not right. It happens in the blink of an eye. So I opened it up, and there was this thick sludge surrounding pretty much all the parts on the inside. He had sprayed, rather than opening up the side plate, he had sprayed through the back of the hammer recess area where the hammer is and up and through the trigger. He had sprayed WD-40. Well, in our state of Maine, it was getting cold, and when WD-40 gets cold, it gets thick. It also is flammable. So when it gets lit on fire, whatever is left over that doesn't burn up pretty much caramelizes inside the action. So that was what was causing his thing. So I put it in an ultrasonic cleaner, put all the parts back in, and the thing worked great. And I told him, do not ever use WD-40 on your revolver again.
It is a water displacement. That's what WD means. And that is Formula 40.
The biggest thing with revolvers, in my opinion, and some people may send you hate mail on this, revolvers are not as dependent upon lubrication as semi-autos are. Yes, they are a mechanical object and they do need some lubrication, but they don't need to be overly lubricated. And one of the problems that can cause if you do too much is if, let's say, you carry the gun in a pocket or whatever, that oil is going to attract lint, which is something you don't want. Lint, dirt, anything else that's in the pocket, which is something obviously that you don't want. So I lightly lube the operating parts of the gun. The other thing is, when you're taking the side plate off, this is like probably the number one thing I see that gets messed up on a revolver, especially a Smith & Wesson. People will undo the screws on the side of the gun, and then they will go ahead and try to take the screwdriver, the flathead, and pry the side plate off. Don't do that. You'll just gouge it. Grab the frame of the revolver, take the wooden handle from, and obviously you have to take the grips off to get the side plate off anyway. take the handle of a hammer, like the wooden handle, don't use anything metal, and take all the screws off the side plate and lightly tap on the side of the grip frame, and that side plate should just fall right off, probably by the third or fourth tap, and you won't gouge the side plate, and you'll take it off properly.
Okay.
Basically, they're like we said, everybody says Glocks are semi-automatic revolvers, basically, and really that's the truth. They are very forgiving when it comes to maintenance. Mm-hmm. There are just some things you want to be careful of. You want to make sure, like, your ejector rod, the thing that ejects the cartridges and pushes the ejector star out, you want to make sure that doesn't get bent or unscrewed. I have had that happen to me. I've had the ejector rod come unscrewed on a Smith & Wesson, and it actually tied the gun up. So you want to be careful about that. You also want to make sure that if you're shooting .38 Special inside of a .357 Magnum revolver, and then you're going to go shoot .357s, because of the different length of the cartridge, you want to make sure that you scrub out those chambers really well. The shorter .38 Special will leave a ring of carbon deposit on the inside of the chamber, which can cause problems either with extraction or loading .357 Magnums because they're much longer than the .38s. Really, though, revolvers are very forgiving, like we said. I mean, if you keep them fairly clean, I haven't cleaned my Model 60. I mean, I've taken the carbon off the outside, but I haven't pulled it open in a long time, and it's still working great. They tend not to get a lot of carbon fouling on the inside. There's not, between where the cartridge is and all that stuff, there really isn't a lot of place for the carbon fouling to get inside the action. Mm-hmm. The majority of the problems I've seen from people having dirty actions on the inside is actually putting way too much lubricant in there, and it just attracts the dirt and everything.
Okay. What products do you use to clean your revolvers?
I just use basically some nitro solvent and Rem oil.
Okay. Pretty simple stuff then, nothing.
Yeah, and lightly. Like, I cannot emphasize that enough. Just enough to give it some lubrication to make it not be bare metal on bare metal. Okay.
Minimum amount. So let's talk about calibers, because I think obviously, other than the cylinder and it being a revolver, one thing that really separates revolvers from any type of handgun is the caliber, because obviously they're just, those calibers do not load in an autoload or a semi-automatic. So, but that's what calibers are known for, right? Is pretty much their calibers, right?
Well, some of them do load, like the Desert Eagle was chambered originally in .357 Magnum, and then went to .44 Magnum, and then .50 AE, obviously. The problem with revolver rounds, or the problem, I say, is they are rimmed cartridges. Your automatic or semi-automatic pistol rounds, like 9mm, other stuff like that, they all headspace on the case mouth. So when you load it in there, that case mouth is jutting up against a small ledge in the chamber and keeping the bullet where it's supposed to be and having the proper headspace. On a revolver, it actually headspaces on the thick rim at the back end of the cylinder. So if you were to take a rimless pistol round on most revolvers, it would just drop right through the cylinder, unless it's stepped, like some of the 45 ACP guns. So that rim, while it helps the gun headspace, the cartridge headspace in the revolver, in autos it can cause problems because of stuff like rim lock and stuff like that. So most of these cartridges you're going to see in revolvers, .38 Special, .357 Magnum, .44 Special, .44 Magnum, they're all very popular and they're very powerful. .38 Special, people will debate you, but I don't want to be shot by one. 38 Special really was the most popular police load for a very long time throughout most of the 1900s. People were using 158 grain round nose lead bullets, which didn't really have the stopping power they needed and could be easily deflected, but they were a huge step up from some of the older cartridges. And then in 1935, the .357 Magnum came about, which was basically just an extended .38 Special. It was used by one of the Wesson brothers for hunting. He actually shot some big game with it and tried to promote the gun. And then we had the .44 Special, and then Elmer Keith worked on the development of the .44 Magnum with Remington and Smith & Wesson, and developed that cartridge, which is basically the same concept, just an extended version of the .44 Special. And they can be used, the 44 Magnum in particular, can be used for hunting. And then some of the smaller rounds, like the 38 Special, the 357 Magnum, really hit their stride in the self-defense realm. For a long time, the one of the best quote-unquote one-shot stop cartridges was the 125 grain jacketed hollow point 357 Magnum. It was causing fairly shallow yet devastating wounds and causing people to stop what they were doing without killing them. Rather than using a 38 Special and punching, maybe up to 12 little tiny holes through someone that would go through and let them bleed out, the 357 Magnum was doing these shallow wounds and transferring a lot of energy to the target, which was causing people, whatever crime they were doing, they would stop pretty much immediately. And then you saw later people actually wanted to have that same power in automatic, so they developed the 357 SIG to try to approximate it, which some say it worked, some say it didn't. And then some of the custom guns, and these are some things you couldn't ever chamber in a semi-automatic pistol, is like some of the ones done by Hamilton Bowen can be things like the double-action Ruger Red Hawk, and he chambers some of those in 500 line baw or 50 Action Express, which are just huge, massive revolver rounds.
Yeah. Speaking of calibers like that, what are some like oddball calibers, and were there any that were maybe famous back then but have just kind of maybe died out of existence that people haven't heard of but maybe like used to be famous or something?
Well, one of the big things you saw back in the 1800s when the advent of the revolver really hit its stride in the 1860s, 1870s, and so on, was the concept of having cartridges that would transfer between the rifle and the revolver. I believe everybody thinks that 45 Colt was the most popular cartridge in the Colt Peacemaker, but if I remember correctly, I believe the 4440 Winchester Centerfire was. Now, the 4440 is a necked down, it's a bottleneck case using a 40 caliber bullet, and it is probably was one of the most popular cartridges back then because it could be used in the Winchester lever action or in the Colt Peacemaker. And for someone who's on a horse and maybe hundreds of miles from the nearest supply line, that's a huge deal. It's a huge advantage. People also had stuff like the 3220, which is a cartridge I really enjoy. I fired a Smith & Wesson hand ejector from the early 1900s in 3220. It's a great cartridge. It's a really good small game cartridge, and it was used for self-defense back then. Today, we would probably scoff at it because it's a 32, but it's still going to hurt. And then modern times, we have the development of much more powerful rounds, and we also have stuff like the 327 Federal Magnum, which at first it was touted as the latest, greatest new thing, and it's kind of fallen by the wayside, similar to the 45 Gap. It was based off the 32 H&R Magnum, so it's basically an extended 32 H&R Magnum, and you can shoot 327 Federal Magnum, or step down to 32 H&R, or even step down to 32 Smith & Wesson Long. So the 32 calibers were really popular, especially in the early 1900s in revolvers. And then one of the more powerful ones in the latest development in the modern times is the 454 Casull, and that's an extended 45 Long Colt case. And that is a really powerful hunting cartridge and was chambered in a lot of the Freedom Arms single-action revolvers. And then you have the 500 Smith & Wesson and the 460, which is an extended 454.
Yes.
So in the 460s, you can shoot 460, 454, or 45 Long Colt.
Okay. And don't take those heavy calibers and put them in. People have never shot a gun. Don't do that.
Yes, please do not do that. We laugh, but there have been people who have been killed because people handed them a Smith & Wesson 500 and it doubled on them.
Yeah.
Meaning that the gun, they've got their hand on the gun and they're not holding it right because they're new. I mean, you can't fault them for not holding the damn thing right. And they'll pull the trigger, and under recoil, before their finger can let off, they let off a little bit, and it pulls the trigger again. And I believe there was a girl in Missouri or Minnesota who shot herself in the head and killed her because it doubled on her and the gun was pointed back at her.
Yep. No, I was just talking about that at work one of these days here. So somebody was in there talking about taking their significant other go shoot a Smith & Wesson 500, and I was very adamant about them not doing that at all, ever again.
Yeah.
But kind of going back to caliber, but the most common is 38 Special 357 Magnum, right? That's the most.
Yeah, I would say that's probably the most common. That's the one you see most everything chambered in, and a lot of times nowadays I've seen this trend, more guns chambered for 357. Like the J frames used to be exclusively chambered in 38 Special, and then once we developed greater metallurgy and stuff with modern manufacturing, we started chambering a lot more guns in 357 Magnum simply because that gave you the extra option of you can shoot 38 in it or you can shoot 357. In the J-frame guns that are chambered in 357, you'll never see me put around a 357 in them. It's just too much. It's punishing. In 38 Special, I love shooting my J-frame. So it really depends. I mean, you can, but it doesn't mean you should.
Yeah. Yeah, that applies in a lot of things. One thing we didn't talk about, though, was capacity of revolvers. Obviously, and here's something I kind of find funny, what we were talking about is, I forgot I took my Glock 42 out, is capacity. And the funny thing is, the new thing now, for example, Glock 42 here, magazine carries 6. Obviously, I have +1 in it for carrying it, but everybody with bags on revolvers not being able to carry enough ammunition. But now the new thing is going as small as possible in semi-autos, which then puts their capacity about down to the same as revolvers. So I think it's kind of funny that some people knock on revolvers for not having enough capacity, yet that's where the market is really going right now, is smaller subcompacts that will actually carry near about the same amount as a revolver.
Right.
But that's kind of a knock on revolvers. I think it's kind of funny we're headed that way. But generally, revolvers hold like 5 or 6, right?
Yeah, the Smith & Wesson J frames will typically hold 5 rounds. You have the Colt Detective Special, which is the D frame, which is now discontinued, and that holds 6 rounds. Essentially the same size almost as the J frame. The cylinder's a little bit wider. And then you have the oddball guns, some of which hold 7 and 8. There's a Smith & Wesson TRR-8, which is a tactical revolver. I believe it has a 4-inch barrel. It has Picatinny rails on the bottom and on the top, so you can mount a red dot or a flashlight underneath. And it holds 8 rounds. And it is cut for using moon clips. And sort of talking about capacity, we'll talk about the reloads as well. You have several options for reloads. You either have loading individual rounds, which you just put them in, which isn't terribly fast, but you can get pretty fast by doing it, practicing your technique. Then you have speed loaders, which hold all the rounds, and then you either have a button to push with the heel of your hand or a knob to twist, which will release the rounds into the cylinder. So you basically just line up the bullet noses into the chambers, twist the knob, and they'll just drop in. And then you just drop the speed loader, close the cylinder, and get back to work. Or you use the moon clip. In the moon clip, you'll see a lot more with revolvers that are chambered in auto pistol cartridges because they don't have that rim. In World War II, we entered World War I, rather. Sorry, we entered World War I, and we realized that we did not have enough semi-automatic pistols, semi-automatic 1911s, to give to the troops. So Smith & Wesson was tasked with developing a way to chamber the 45 ACP in their revolvers. An engineer at Smith figured out how to use this stamped piece of sheet steel, which held 3 rounds, and you could clip the rounds, the rim, where the extractor groove is on the back of a 45 cartridge, into the moon clip, and then you'd have these 2 moon clips that you would just drop right into the cylinder, and that would allow you to eject them as well. So that's the moon clip, and then they've developed into full moon clips. You don't have to use 2 now. I don't like the moon clips for concealed carry because if they get slightly bent, they can tie up the gun. When I carry the revolver, I carry a 5-round speed loader and 5 in the gun. I use a 125 grain 38 special, and really, as long as you practice with the speed loader, you can get pretty fast. And I mean, you look at people like Jerry Mikulek, who's using moon clips, and he did, back in the late 90s, I think he did 6 shots, a reload, and 6 more shots in 2.99 seconds. All on target. And that's with moon clips, so I mean, it's a little bit faster than a speed loader, but he's pretty fast with the speed loader too. So as long as you practice, I mean, yes, it does take more dedication to be able to do it, but if you practice, you can get pretty fast with a speed loader. And revolvers do one thing by holding less rounds. They teach you how to judge shot placement. A lot of the times I've heard people with semi-autos, they tend to think, oh, well, I don't need to aim because I've got so many rounds. I can make up with, volume of fire rather than shot placement. And they end up missing under stress. When they're confronted with a stressful situation or you put them into a stressful training situation, they end up missing. They say, oh, well, I'll just get the next one. Oh, I'll get it on the next one. Those who practice with a revolver they're fully aware of the limited capacity, and they're just going to be more aware of the sight picture, the trigger technique, and their overall form. And then, like we said earlier, making up for that loss of capacity, the revolver can typically chamber much bigger rounds than most automatics. So sometimes you may only need so many shots. But shot placement is going to be key with any handgun, semi-automatic or revolver, but even more so with the revolver because you have that limited round count.
Okay. Kind of jumping a little bit here on the show notes. Since we're kind of talking about CCW in that aspect, again, I'm not familiar at all with revolvers. That's why I have you on. You're definitely far, far more knowledgeable. I've seen a couple people start carrying for CCW like the LCRX. I think there's a bunch of Smith & Wesson models out there. But from your opinion, can you maybe recommend, I guess, number one, maybe tell some people why it might be really good for them to concealed carry a revolver. Maybe, I think there's probably some specific roles that concealed carrying a revolver probably fits very well and functions very well. And then could you maybe recommend a couple models?
Revolvers, you'll tend to see revolvers used a lot as backup guns. A lot of cops will carry them on their ankle in an ankle holster, which I hate ankle holsters, but they tend to be reliable, like we said earlier, and stuff like that, especially with a backup gun, that's going to be a gun that you put on every day, you take off every day, you don't really think about. It's not something that you're out at the range shooting, every qualification, stuff like that. So, that maintenance, that getting knocked around as a backup gun, maybe in a weird position or in deep cover, being a revolver may offer you a little bit more reliability. When you're choosing a revolver for concealed carry, I highly recommend a double-action only revolver, like the Smith & Wesson 442 or the 642. The two reasons I say that: one, the reason we talked about earlier, where the prosecutor can kind of say, oh, well, he didn't mean to shoot the person because he cocked the revolver and accidentally triggered it. You don't want that. You're already going to have enough to worry about in a court encounter with a defensive shooting situation. That's the last thing you need on your plate. Don't give them the rope to hang you with. The other thing I say when it comes to choosing a defensive revolver that's double action, when you're drawing, especially from the pocket, or really anything, that hammer can get snagged really easily. And when you're on the draw, the last thing you need is the gun to snag and slow down your draw, because you're already in a situation where you need to be as fast as possible. Like my Model 60, for instance, has that spur hammer, and I've actually had to train myself when I draw to put my thumb over it, and I'm looking to get that thing actually converted to double action only here soon. So that's why I've really stopped carrying that, because of my concern with either snagging and the liability also of the single action cocking mechanism. The LCRX, the LCR original one without the hammer, I highly recommend. I've heard great things about the grip, the trigger pull, because they redesigned how the trigger pull functions, and the overall weight. It's a very light gun, and it's also comparatively cheaper to some of the Smith models. The LCR is made out of like a polymer. It's got an internal metal chassis that supports it, but it has a polymer outer exterior. The Smith & Wesson models are made out of typically, especially the airweight guns. I highly recommend airweight, especially for pocket carry. Those guns are typically made out of like either titanium or any of scandium or any of the other materials that are really light but also very strong. So if I had to recommend a gun for CCW, a decent price, and I think you can find these for around $450 to $500, is the Smith & Wesson Model 442. I think that's going to be a great choice. The 642 is quite a bit more expensive than that, a couple $100, I believe, but the 442 I've seen a lot of good stuff with, and they are hammerless. Well, not hammerless, but they have no exposed hammer. The hammer's on the inside of the gun.
Okay, so again, there's nothing to snag on when you're drawing.
Right. Yeah, much easier to pull from the pocket.
Okay. So thank you for that. I will definitely have to be on the lookout because I'm sure eventually at work someone's going to want a revolver. So I'll be there. So let's move on to some fun stuff here at the end. What about famous revolvers? Obviously, when anybody says famous revolvers, you got to think, okay, well, Dirty Harry gun got to be number one, and that's the Model 29. Can you tell people a little bit about that one? I mean, I think when those movies came out, like those things like sold like no other, didn't they?
They did, and the funny thing is, if I remember correctly, the Model 29 came out, I believe, in 1955. And up until that point, it wasn't really their most popular gun. It didn't really sell 1955. It didn't really sell a lot. Well, in 1971, Dirty Harry came out. And the director, John Milius, had a 44. He was a firearms enthusiast, still is. And he had a 44 Magnum. So they used the gun in the production, and before then, the guns probably didn't sell that much, and after that, you couldn't find them. And then a lot of the times you would see guns that are back on the dealer's shelf in the case with a case of ammunition inside that has 6 rounds missing from it. And the people bought them, either didn't shoot them and put them away and kept them, or took them out, shot them, decided it was way too much for them, and brought it back. And you got to remember, this is back in the day, the 70s, when 44 Magnum, or, well, in the 1950s, I mean, 44 Magnum, people were used to 38 Special and 357 Magnum. They weren't prepared for this huge kicking revolver. And for some reason, to me, 44 Magnum doesn't kick that bad, especially after having fired a 500. But I mean, I like shooting 44 Magnum. So I mean, 44 Magnum really ushered in the big bore revolver enthusiast thing that you see nowadays with stuff like the 454 Casull and the 500 Smith & Wesson Magnum, and it is no longer the most powerful handgun in the world.
Yeah. That was the big thing back then, though, wasn't it? It was the most powerful handgun in the world.
Yeah.
What other popular ones are there? I have written down the Colt Single Action Army. Obviously, the Smith & Wesson Military M&P Model 10. Like I said, that was popular in real life, and I'm trying to think of all like the 70s TV shows. All had those.
Yeah, basically throughout the 1900s, the Smith & Wesson Military and Police, or the Model 10 as it later became known when Smith switched to a number system for their model designations, it was really like the bread and butter gun for most of your police departments. It was the Glock of its day, essentially. You also had, and they had revolver wars basically between Colt and Smith & Wesson. Some years Colt would dominate the police market, other years Smith & Wesson would dominate the police market, and Colt produced the police positive and stuff like that, or the official police, and that was also a very popular double-action gun for the cops. The single-action Army, obviously one of the first large-bore cartridge-firing revolvers, along with the Smith & Wesson No. 3, or the Smith & Wesson Schofield. The Colt Single Action Army, you actually find a lot of guns nowadays that derive their design from that gun, like the Ruger Blackhawk, the Ruger Single 6, a lot of the Uberti copies, the single action revolvers that you see designed for like cowboy action shooting, all take their cues from the Colt Single Action Army.
Yeah.
And then nowadays you have stuff like the Freedom Arms. Have you ever seen any of those?
I have not in person.
They have somewhat of the lines of a Colt Single Action Army, but they are larger. Like the Freedom Arms Model 97 is chambered in God knows how many calibers. The main one that you see it chambered in is 454 Casull. It's built like a bank vault. It's a very, very ultra high quality revolver and can handle just massive cartridges. And a lot of the times you'll see those used for handgun hunting.
Okay. I know handgun hunting out here is somewhat popular here in Wisconsin. I'm pretty sure everybody carries 44 Magnums out here for that, from what I've seen, anyways. And here we're gonna hit one more thing, then we're gonna wrap up the show. But are there any revolvers that people should just stay away from? Are there just, I mean, I would say in the semi-auto world, I would say Taurus, just don't go there. Does that apply with their revolvers too, or anybody else for that matter?
I've tend to seen problems with the older Taurus guns. The newer ones, Yes and no. If you get a Taurus revolver, you put 250 rounds through it and it doesn't fail, then I think you're probably set. Typically, I'll see those fail within the first 200, 300 rounds. Charter is, you have the lower quality brands, and I'm not going to necessarily say they are bad. They may encounter more problems that need to be fixed than some of the higher quality brands. You got to remember, people will go look at a revolver and they'll say, man, why does that cost so much? There's a lot more machining that goes into building a revolver, a lot more, I don't want to say hand fitting because there isn't really in modern manufacturing a lot of hand fitting, but there's a lot more that goes into them. There's a lot more, okay, this has to do this at this exact moment through the trigger stroke, and you have to make sure all that's right. So they tend to be a little bit more expensive than your average semi-autos, where you can get a Ruger LCP for like $350. Good luck finding a Smith & Wesson 442 for anywhere is under $400. Okay. I wouldn't say like Charter's not bad, but if that's all you can afford, by all means, and Charter will probably stand behind if you have any problems. But they tend to fail more often than the higher quality brands.
Okay. So if it's going to be a CCW weapon, probably want to shade those, unless, again, it's the only thing you can afford, because I think we all agree having a gun is better than no gun.
Yes.
Even if it's a high point. I'll say that.
I like the high points. I don't get why people rag on them.
We actually had a guy come into our shop and special order a high point because, I quote, it's the most comfortable handgun he's ever felt. So,
I think the problem is people rag on it because of its A, low price point, but B, the way it looks.
Looks like a taser.
Right, but once I explain to them why it looks that way, they kind of understand it. That's how it functions. They're all straight blowback, so they need to be big and heavy to keep the gun locked up till the pressure drops.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of people don't understand, why would they design a gun that looks like that? Well, it's because they have to.
It is cheaper to manufacture that way, too.
Right.
So, but we're going to wrap it up here, and so you guys know I've been plugging Ryan's show the past couple weeks. Actually, I love his show, listen to his podcast. So Ryan, for those out there that are maybe watching on YouTube or that listen to us, don't listen to you, tell us about Handgun Radio, man.
Well, Handgun Radio, we basically talk anything about handguns or the handgun world. We've interviewed people like Joe Montaigne. He's a big gun guy. Hamilton Bowen, a custom revolver smith. Doug Turnbull, a guy who does a lot of color case hardening and finishing, refinishing of guns. Masad Ayub was on a few weeks ago.
Awesome show.
Yeah, basically just stuff, anything about handguns. We'll talk. We did a show about pocket carry, and we discussed the Ruger LCP. Pretty soon we're going to be doing a show on what is bulletproof and how does bullet-resistant armor, stuff like that. How does that work? So that'll be a really interesting one. And we've had discussions with Grant Cunningham talking about how to gunsmith and his different books. And then we kind of delve into training and stuff. And people say, oh, it's revolver radio. We don't always talk about revolvers. We talk about semi-autos, too. We're equal opportunity.
You are. I like giving you a hard time. Usually, if you record on Sunday nights, right?
Yeah, usually Sunday nights. And then the show posts on Tuesdays around 12 p.m. EST. Okay,
if I remember right, I think Central Time. You record at 8 o'clock, 8 or 7. So usually, not recently because of my new job, but you could usually catch me in there typing in all caps about Glocks, not talking about them. So, but it's a great show to watch or listen to, guys. So please check out Handgun Radio. It's definitely one of my favorite shows on the FRN. So, but Ryan, thanks for coming on, man. I really appreciate this kind of Revolver 101 chat. I know I learned a ton, and a lot of little things too I didn't like. We were talking about the head spacing or where it catches in the revolver. Like, I didn't even think about catches. It's opposite for semi-autos compared to revolvers. I mean, something I should have noticed, and boom, right off the top of my head knew. But something like, hey, I didn't realize that, and I should have known it. So.
Hey, no problem. It was enjoyable. I had a good time.
So thanks for coming on again, man. And for everybody out there listening, we really want to share feedback here at Practically Tactical. So please send us any compliments, feedback, guest suggestions to nick@firearmsradio.tv. Please give us a review on iTunes as it helps us out a bunch there. And again, go find us on Facebook by searching Practically Tactical. Also go find Handgun Radio on Facebook. They need way more likes. Awesome show. They need way more people liking their Facebook page. So please go check them out on Facebook as well. There's definitely links on my Facebook page to his for this show, so easy to find. Or just go to facebook.com/Handgun Radio and you can find it. So, Ryan, thanks for coming on, man. For all you guys out there listening, thank you very much for tuning in. We greatly appreciate you guys out there, and we'll see you next week for another episode of Practically Tactical.